The current city election year got off to a heady start with the exit of an incumbent mayor and a successor who broke barriers of race and gender. You could even say that continued a shift that ushered in change 3 years ago with Ayanna Pressley and Rachel Rawlins. But there could also be comparisons with earlier times when even candidates who campaigned for change governed more conventionally. As an ideas writer for the Boston Globe, our guest explored the question of radical change in one-on-one conversations with this year's 5 mayoral candidates. To tell us what he found is David Scharfenberg. Thank you very much for being with us, David.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
David, I'm going to start with the headline over your ideas piece, because I say the radical change at the heart of this election. What makes you feel that this election is at heart radical?
Yes, I think, and I think it was the radical question, which was, can these mayoral candidates actually affect big change in the city? The premise of the piece is that, as you suggested in your intro, we've had in the last several years, maybe dating back to Ayanna Pressley's victory in the city council race before she became a congresswoman, a sense of a new kind of politics coming, both a more diverse set of politicians. We've seen a number of women of color in particular take positions on the city council, but also with that, the promise of a different kind of politics, something that was more focused on equity, more concerned about justice, more concerned with Black and Latino and Asian residents of the city and sort of their needs. And the city council, though, is not a terribly powerful body in this city. Power is really concentrated in the mayor's office. So I think the question here is, can these candidates who now have a real shot at the mayoral office, can they build a political coalition that will allow them to actually win the mayor's race? And then can they actually affect the sort of more radical change they're talking about once they're in place? Given the political strictures of a city like Boston that still has, a good number of moderate and conservative voters, and also just the limits on the power of a mayor in this city or any city really to affect some of the big issues around climate change and racial inequality and such that these candidates have really focused on.
One takeaway I had from reading your article is that when you sit down with the candidates, including some who've advanced some ideas that at one point or another seemed truly, radical, things got a little more nuanced as they explained them. Did you have that feeling?
Sure. Are you referring to what some of the issues?
Either like maybe Michelle Wu on rent control and development, or maybe some ideas from Kim Janey?
Sure. Yes. I think, Michelle Wu, for instance, has sort of revived the idea of rent control, which was something that was pretty verboten, I think, in Boston politics and Massachusetts politics for the last, couple of decades, since voters put some real restrictions on that here in Massachusetts. And I think she frames it as one tool that we might use. As sort of a stopgap measure, for instance, while we work on greater affordability in this city. I asked some of the candidates about reparations, for instance, which a suburb of Chicago, Illinois, became the first municipality in the country to actually put something in place. They've got a $10 million program, I think it is there, for Black residents who can prove that either their family or themselves have been the subject of discrimination around redlining or other concerns like that. So I asked that some of the candidates here, okay, you're talking about a radical new kind of politics. Is this something you would pursue? And I had a couple of candidates who said they were interested in it, but maybe stopped short a bit of discussing what exactly it would look like. Anissa Asabi George, who has sort of pitched herself as the moderate in this race, as setting herself apart from the more progressive candidates, didn't want to go there and said we should really focus on kind of broader policies that might help those in need in Boston. And so you do get some hedges and some nuance here and there for sure. But I think the mere act of talking about these things, I mean, no candidate for mayor in the last competitive election would have talked about reparations, for instance, or a Green New Deal for the city, which Michelle Wu has discussed. Just that these things are at the center of the debate now is interesting. And I think we'll have some effect, perhaps limited, but some effect on Boston politics and what we think is possible and what is actually attempted to put in place.
And even defunding the police, in the street, it sounded pretty loud and sweeping. From the candidates, it's much more limited.
It is. Andrea Campbell is the candidate probably most associated with this particular call. And she has called for diverting 10% or more, I think is the language, of the police budget into social services of one kind or another. That is not quite defunding the police, but that's nonetheless a pretty significant amount of money and a proposal, if she were to become mayor, that I'm sure would face some opposition from police union and others who are public safety minded. So these are not massively sweeping changes necessarily, but they're significant nonetheless.
Now, there are some people who are starting to say right now, well, last year was the year of the radical slogans. This year is the year of Eric Adams and Curtis Sliwa, like the final race for mayor in New York City, the cop versus the former guardian angel. Does that apply in Boston, or do you think things are going to be quite different here?
I think this is a different place. Crime, and for that matter, police reform, haven't registered as major crises in this city. There was greater concern about that among New York voters, I think, according to the polling. So I do think there's a difference there. There's also some racial dynamics in that New York race that I think are sometimes brushed over. Eric Adams, who won the Democratic primary, a former police officer, is Black, and that certainly helped him win over a number of Black and Latino voters who were a real important constituency for him in that Democratic primary. The sort of rough equivalent of his candidacy here is Anissa Essabi George in terms of being more moderate, more concerned with crimes and public safety issues. She identifies as a person of color. Her father emigrated from Tunisia, but she has not performed particularly well among Black and Latino voters in the polls thus far. So I don't think she necessarily has that natural constituency among Black and Latino voters, who actually tend to be more moderate in a lot of ways than white voters. So the polling here and in other cities is bearing that out. So I think we do have some different dynamics here, but we'll see how that plays out in the preliminary and in the final election.
What about the electorate in Boston right now? Because in a city election, especially a preliminary, you get a disproportionately high representation of white voters, but the city's population has changed. There are more people in general, people of color, and the white electorate itself has changed. What do you see?
It has. I think that is maybe the biggest question in this mayor's race. Who will turn out? What's that electorate going to look like? The last couple of mayoral elections, the electorate has been about 65% white, according to some data that a firm called Target Smart provided to me. They do kind of voter data analysis for Democratic candidates. So will it look like that again? Or has the city changed sufficiently enough in the last 4 years? And does the composition of this field, which has a lot of candidates of color, and for that matter, a lot of candidates of color running for city council seats. We've got all these city councilors running for mayor. So now, of course, there's all these open seats on the city council. And so will that change the composition of the electorate in a significant way? And I don't think anyone can really pretend to know the answer to that yet. So we'll have to see what that looks like. And as you mentioned, the white electorate, I think that shorthand isn't what it once was. That doesn't necessarily mean all more traditional kind of moderate or conservative voters. We have a fast-growing contingent of white progressive voters in the city, as we do in other cities too. I mean, the sort of white liberal vote in the New York City race, for instance, that we were just talking about, did not go to Eric Adams. It went to more progressive candidates there. So in our Boston Globe poll, which is a little dated now, goes back to June, but it was Michelle Wu, a self-identified progressive, who was leading among white voters, not Anissa Essabi George, who is the moderate. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
I was looking at the comments under your article, and I have to admit that they seem to overrepresent people who are well to the right of the Boston electorate. Maybe they're outside the electorate altogether, but right. They were quite taken, at least one of them was quite taken with a comment by Anissa Essabi George responding to some of the ideas from the other candidates, saying that, well, they believe in unicorns and I don't.
Yeah. Right, right. That's for sure. She has made a very conscious effort to position herself as the moderate, she would say the realist in this race, someone who is more concerned with issues of public safety and basic city services, fixing up parks and picking up the trash. And then things she would say are really consequential, improving special education, getting more kind of quality schools around the city. She's very consciously set herself up that way because she knows, I think that's what she believes for sure, but she also knows that there is a real political niche to be had there, given that the other candidates in the race have all identified as progressives. And that certainly appeals to a good slice of the Boston electorate. The most recent polls we've seen suggest she is moving up in the ranks and has a real shot at least making the final two in this preliminary election next month in September. Whether she can win at the end, we'll see. She has to make it to the final first, and the city has shifted. I think she would still probably be an underdog, but she's certainly to be reckoned with.
Finally, most of us encounter these candidates in social media feeds or scripted events. You sat down one-on-one with them at a table. Did that lead to any differences in your impressions of these people?
It's a good question. It is a nice privilege of being a journalist in this town and being able to meet with some of these folks in person. They've all got their Michelle Wu. When you sit down with her, strikes you as someone who has really thought things through. She's been in city government for a while. She has a very detailed idea for what she'd like to get done. That was really my biggest takeaway impression there. I think, whether she can get some of her ambitious ideas put in place is another question, of course, but she clearly has thought it through. Kim Janey is pretty guarded, I find. So it takes a little poking to try to get at some of her ideas. She's also running a somewhat cautious campaign in that she is really running as the sitting mayor, the acting mayor in this case, and trying to run on her record of the last few months, and is a little hesitant to make kind of grand policy pronouncements. You get some sense of that, I think, over the course of the campaign, but when you sit with her, you really do get that feel. She would say that her life experience is really pivotal, I think, and is guiding what she has done and will do. I could go on, but that gives you a bit of a flavor for it.
Well, if people want to look for more of your impressions as they come down the line, how can they keep track of you on social media and other places?
Sure. Well, I've got a Twitter account at @DScharfGlobe. And I hope to do some more writing about the campaign as well as things unfold. It's going to be a fascinating race. And of course, plenty more at the Globe writ large to be read. So hopefully your viewers will take a look, and in addition to tuning into you.
Right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
It was David Scharfenberg from the Boston Globe. We'll have more news in just a moment.